Before I begin, if you've ever lived through betrayal like this or watched your life split in two without warning, please like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. I've always been the quiet one, the kind of man people overlook because I don't raise my voice or demand attention. I show up early, leave late, do my job, and go home. That's how I lived my marriage, too. I believed that consistency mattered more than grand gestures, that loyalty was louder than words. For 15 years, I built my life around that belief, and for 15 years, I thought my wife understood it. Her name was Claire. She was sharp, charming, and effortlessly confident in rooms where I preferred to stay invisible. People gravitated toward her. She told stories that made strangers feel like friends. I admired that about her. I thought we balanced each other out. Where she was fire, I was ground. Where she spoke, I listened. Somewhere along the way, that balance shifted, and I didn't notice until it was already gone. The first crack wasn't dramatic. It was small things. Late nights she didn't explain, phone calls she took outside, a new password on her laptop. When I asked, she laughed it off, called me paranoid, said I was working too much. I wanted to believe her. Wanting to believe someone is a powerful thing. It can silence instincts that are screaming for attention. I worked as a senior compliance analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and stability mattered to me. My coworkers respected me. My boss trusted me. That office was one of the few places where I felt solid ground under my feet, especially as things at home grew colder and more distant. Claire started talking about needing space, about feeling stuck, about how I didn't fight hard enough for us. I didn't realize at the time that she was already planning her exit. The day it happened was a Tuesday, ordinary. Gray sky, burnt coffee, the hum of printers and muted conversations. I was reviewing a report at my desk when I felt a presence beside me. I looked up to see a man in a tailored suit holding a folder with my name printed neatly on the front. He smiled the way professionals do when they're about to ruin someone's day. "Are you Daniel Harper?" he asked. I nodded, already feeling that slow, sinking pull in my chest. He introduced himself as Claire's attorney and, without lowering his voice, informed me that I was being served divorce papers. Conversations around us quieted. I could feel eyes on my back, curiosity mixing with pity. It was public, intentional, a performance. He placed the folder on my desk like it was just another document, something routine. My hands didn't shake, but my chest felt hollow. 15 years reduced to paperwork, delivered like a memo. I remember thinking that this must be what humiliation tastes like. Dry, metallic, hard to swallow. The lawyer waited, clearly expecting a reaction. Anger, pleading, shock. I gave him none of that. I thanked him calmly, reached into my briefcase, and pulled out an envelope with his name on it. It was thick, heavy with meaning. I handed it to him and said, "Please make sure your client sees this." His smile faltered just for a second. He looked at the envelope, then back at me, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. Professionals know when something carries weight. He nodded and walked away, leaving me surrounded by silence and unasked questions. I sat there for a long moment after he left. My coworkers pretended not to stare. Someone cleared their throat. The office noise slowly resumed, but nothing felt normal. Inside, though, I wasn't panicking. I wasn't even surprised, because the truth was I'd been preparing for this moment months ago. When the cracks first appeared in my marriage, I didn't confront Claire. I observed, I listened, I documented. That wasn't spite, it was survival. Something in me knew that the woman I'd married was capable of rewriting history if it suited her. I'd seen the way she controlled narratives in social settings, how easily she could make herself the victim and someone else the villain. I didn't want to believe she turned that skill on me, but I wasn't naive enough to ignore the possibility. I started keeping records quietly, financial statements, emails, text messages. I consulted a lawyer of my own, discreetly, not to file anything, but to understand my position. He told me something that stuck with me. Truth doesn't need to be loud, but it does need to be prepared. I took that to heart. Over the next few months, I discovered things that hurt more than I expected. Accounts I didn't know about, money moved without explanation, messages between Claire and someone she claimed was just a friend, full of plans and promises that didn't include me. And then there was the document, the one that changed everything, a legally obtained piece of evidence that showed she'd been falsifying information, not just to me, but in ways that would matter in court. I didn't confront her. I didn't let on that I knew. At home, I remained the same quiet man she thought she understood. Inside, though, I was grieving the marriage I thought I had, while also building a case I hoped I'd never need. That envelope I handed her lawyer wasn't revenge, it was insurance. After work that day, I went home to an empty house. Claire had already moved some of her things out. It felt surreal walking through rooms filled with echoes of arguments we never finished and laughter that now felt borrowed. I sat at the kitchen table and opened the divorce papers properly for the first time. The accusations were worse than I expected. Claims of emotional neglect, financial irresponsibility, even insinuations of misconduct. It was a story where I barely recognized myself, painted as distant, controlling, and careless. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid of losing the case, but because I was mourning the realization that the woman I loved was willing to burn me publicly to save herself privately. There's a particular kind of pain in knowing that someone you protected for years won't hesitate to expose you if it benefits them. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Claire. Short, cold. "You didn't have to embarrass me at your office," she wrote. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I didn't," I typed. "I just responded." She didn't answer after that. In the days that followed, rumors started reaching me, friends asking careful questions, mutual acquaintances suddenly distant. Claire had begun telling her version of the story, and it traveled fast. In her telling, she was the brave woman escaping a suffocating marriage. I was the unfeeling husband who forced her hand. It hurt, but it also confirmed something important. She was confident. Too confident. She believed her case was airtight. What she didn't know was that the envelope had already landed on her lawyer's desk, and once it was opened, nothing would be the same again. I kept going to work. I kept my routines. On the outside, my life looked unchanged. Inside, I was bracing for impact, knowing that the courtroom would eventually become the place where stories collided with facts. I wasn't eager for that day, but I wasn't afraid of it either, because for the first time in a long while, I knew the truth was on my side, and I was finally ready to let it speak. The first official court notice arrived 2 weeks later, thick and formal, like something that wanted to intimidate me just by existing. I placed it carefully in the same drawer where I kept copies of everything I'd gathered over the months. By then, that drawer felt less like storage and more like a quiet witness to the truth. I remember standing there for a moment, hand on the handle, thinking about how strange it was that my entire marriage could now be reduced to paper and procedure. Claire didn't speak to me directly after that first text. Everything went through her lawyer. He was efficient, sharp, and clearly convinced he had the upper hand. His emails were clipped, confident, sometimes bordering on condescending. He laid out demands that assumed guilt before judgment, terms that painted me as someone desperate to make amends. I read every word slowly, calmly, then forwarded them to my own attorney without comment. My lawyer, Martin, was not flashy. He was older, with a voice that never rose and eyes that missed nothing. When I first brought him the envelope's contents months earlier, he didn't react immediately. He just leaned back, folded his hands, and nodded once. "This changes the landscape," he'd said. Now, as the case began to move, I saw that same quiet certainty return to his face. "Let them talk," he told me during one of our meetings. "Confidence makes people careless." At work, things were awkward but respectful. No one asked outright what had happened, but sympathy lingered in small gestures. A colleague left a coffee on my desk without a word. My supervisor asked if I needed time off. I declined. Structure helped. Routine reminded me that I was still myself, even as everything else shifted. Claire, on the other hand, seemed to be unraveling just beneath the surface. Mutual friends told me she was stressed, angry, frustrated that I wasn't reacting the way she expected. She wanted drama, confrontation, something to validate the story she was telling. My silence denied her that. It also unnerved her. The first mediation session came before any courtroom appearance. We sat across from each other in a neutral room that smelled faintly of old carpet and stale air. Claire looked polished, composed, dressed for impact. When our eyes met, there was no warmth, only calculation. She smiled slightly, as if to say she had already won. The mediator spoke, outlining the process, encouraging cooperation. Claire's lawyer did most of the talking, listing grievances and demands with practiced ease. Emotional neglect, financial mismanagement, a pattern of behavior that justified everything she was asking for. I listened without interruption. When it was my turn, Martin spoke briefly on my behalf, declining most points and requesting that certain claims be formally substantiated. Claire scoffed. "He won't deny it forever," she said, her voice sharp. "This is who he is." Martin glanced at me, then back at the mediator. "We're prepared to proceed," he said calmly. Something flickered across Claire's face then, not fear exactly, but irritation. She wanted this to be easier. She wanted me to fold. When I didn't, the meeting ended without resolution. After that, the pressure increased. Motions filed, deadlines set. Claire's lawyer pushed aggressively, confident that volume could substitute for substance. Meanwhile, Martin and I worked quietly. We organized timelines, cross-referenced documents, prepared responses that were precise and restrained. Every claim they made was met with a request for proof. Every exaggeration was noted. One afternoon, Martin called me into his office unexpectedly. When I arrived, he was holding a familiar envelope, opened now, its contents spread neatly across his desk. "His lawyer contacted me," he said. My chest tightened. "About—" He tapped one of the documents lightly. "About this. He wanted to know if we were serious." I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. And I told him the truth, that this evidence is admissible, verifiable, and damaging. I suggested he advise his client accordingly. The room felt suddenly very quiet. I imagined Claire on the other end of that conversation, hearing for the first time that her story had holes she couldn't patch, that the narrative she'd built might not survive scrutiny. "Did he believe you?" I asked. Martin smiled faintly. "He's a professional. He knows when he's been handed a problem." That night, Claire finally called me. It was the first time I'd heard her voice in weeks. It sounded tight, controlled, like she was holding herself together with sheer will. "What did you give my lawyer?" she demanded. I paused before answering. "You know what I gave him." There was a sharp inhale on the other end. "You think this changes anything? You think you can scare me into backing down?" "I don't want to scare you," I replied evenly. "I want the truth on record." She laughed, but it rang hollow. "You were never this assertive before." "That's because I didn't need to be," I said. "Things are different now." She hung up without another word. As the court date approached, the atmosphere shifted. Claire's filings became more cautious, less theatrical. Some accusations disappeared entirely, replaced with vague language and softened claims. Her confidence, once loud and absolute, began to crack. Friends told me she was anxious, snapping at people, complaining that her lawyer wasn't fighting hard enough. I felt no satisfaction in that, just a dull sadness. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the slow, painful dismantling of something that should have never come to this. The day of the first hearing arrived cold and overcast. I stood outside the courthouse for a moment before going in, watching people hurry past, each carrying their own invisible burdens. Inside, the air was heavy with tension and murmured conversations. When Claire walked in, she didn't look at me. Her lawyer did, though, his expression measured, cautious. The judge was thorough, no nonsense. He listened patiently as Claire's lawyer presented their case, then turned to Martin. One by one, Martin addressed each point, referencing documents, timelines, inconsistencies. The judge's eyebrows knit together slightly as the narrative began to wobble. Then came the moment I'd been preparing for, though I hadn't known exactly how it would feel. Martin requested permission to submit additional evidence. The judge agreed. As the documents were handed over, I watched Claire's posture stiffen. She leaned toward her lawyer, whispering urgently. His jaw tightened. The judge reviewed the materials in silence. The room seemed to hold its breath. When he finally looked up, his tone had changed, sharper, more focused. He asked Claire's lawyer a series of pointed questions, each one probing deeper into claims that now looked questionable at best. "I will need clarification on this," the judge said finally, "and potentially testimony." Claire's face drained of color. The hearing ended with the judge scheduling further proceedings and instructing both parties to prepare for a more detailed examination of the facts. As we stood to leave, Claire finally looked at me. Her eyes were wide, searching, as if she was seeing me for the first time in years. Not as the quiet husband she could maneuver around, but as someone who had stood still enough for the truth to catch up. Outside the courthouse, Martin placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is only the beginning," he said, "but the momentum has shifted." I nodded, feeling the weight of that truth settle in my chest. The envelope had done what it was meant to do, not to destroy, but to reveal. And as much as part of me wished this chapter could end quietly, I knew the hardest moments were still ahead, because when stories collapse, people don't always let go gracefully. The weeks between hearings were some of the longest of my life. On the surface, nothing much happened. No dramatic confrontations, no explosive revelations splashed across a courtroom floor. But underneath that stillness, everything was shifting. I learned quickly that legal battles aren't fought only in courtrooms. They're fought in silence, in waiting, in the steady erosion of certainty. Claire stopped trying to contact me after that phone call. Instead, her lawyer reached out to Martin more frequently, asking for clarifications, requesting copies of documents we had already provided, probing for weaknesses. Each message felt less like an attack and more like reconnaissance. They were trying to figure out how deep the hole went. Martin and I met regularly. He had a habit of spreading papers out across his desk, lining them up by date, then sitting back and letting the timeline speak for itself. Seeing my marriage laid out that way was sobering. Patterns emerged that I hadn't fully understood while I was living inside them. Moments where Claire accused me of being inattentive lined up neatly with unexplained withdrawals. Claims of emotional abandonment overlapped with days she'd spent with someone else, telling me she was working late. "This is why preparation matters," Martin said one afternoon, tapping the table gently. "Emotion blurs memory. Records don't." At home, the house felt emptier every day. Claire had moved out completely by then, leaving behind only the things she didn't care about. I found myself packing boxes slowly, not because I needed to, but because touching old objects helped me process what was ending. A photo from our first apartment, a chipped mug from a road trip years ago. I wasn't angry when I found them, just tired. tired of carrying a story that wasn't true. Word began to filter back to me through the same social channels that had once carried Claire's narrative. The tone was changing. Questions replaced assumptions. People noticed that I wasn't lashing out, wasn't scrambling, wasn't playing the role they'd been told to expect. Silence, it turned out, had a way of unsettling lies. The second hearing focused on finances. Claire had claimed that I controlled our money, that I limited her access and used finances as leverage. It was a painful accusation, one that cut close to my sense of identity. I'd prided myself on being fair, transparent. Sitting there while her lawyer repeated those claims felt like being erased. When it was our turn, Martin methodically dismantled the argument. Joint accounts, equal access, emails where Claire herself managed transfers. Then he introduced the irregularities. Funds moved to accounts I'd never authorized, discrepancies that didn't align with her version of events. The judge listened, asked questions, requested additional documentation. Claire fidgeted beside her lawyer, her composure slipping. At one point she interrupted, trying to explain, her voice rising. The judge stopped her gently but firmly, reminding her to speak through counsel. That small correction carried weight. It was the first time authority had pushed back against her narrative, and it showed. After the hearing, her lawyer approached Martin in the hallway. They spoke quietly for several minutes. I stood a few steps back, watching body language more than words. The confident posture I'd seen months earlier was gone. In its place was something tighter, more cautious. Later, Martin told me that Claire's lawyer had suggested the possibility of settlement. It wasn't an offer, not yet, more like a test, a way to see if I'd be willing to walk away quietly now that the ground was shifting. "What do you want?" Martin asked me. The question caught me off guard. For so long I'd been reacting, preparing, defending. Wanting felt like a luxury. "I want the truth acknowledged," I said after a moment. "I don't want to be painted as someone I'm not. Beyond that, I just want peace." Martin nodded. Then we proceed carefully. Claire didn't take the suggestion of settlement well. That much was clear from the flurry of messages she sent mutual friends, accusing her lawyer of losing his nerve, insisting that I was manipulating the system. It was painful to watch, even from a distance. This wasn't the woman I'd married. Or maybe it was, and I'd just never seen her cornered before. The next hearing introduced witnesses, friends, colleagues, people who had been pulled into the orbit of our marriage without realizing it. One by one, they testified. Some spoke in Claire's favor, recounting moments where she'd confided her unhappiness. Others, more hesitantly, admitted they'd never seen the behavior she described in me. No one painted a clear villain, and that ambiguity mattered. Then came the witness Claire hadn't expected me to call, a financial consultant who'd reviewed our records independently. He spoke calmly, professionally, outlining inconsistencies and patterns that suggested deliberate misrepresentation. As he spoke, I felt the room shift again. Facts have a gravity to them. Once introduced, they pull everything else into alignment. Claire's lawyer cross-examined him aggressively at first, then more cautiously, then not at all. When he sat down, he didn't look at his client. I watched Claire closely throughout it all. The confidence that once defined her was gone, replaced by a brittle intensity. She took notes furiously, whispered constantly, her eyes darting between the judge, her lawyer, and me. When our eyes met, there was something new there, not anger, fear. During a break, she approached me in the hallway. For a moment, we stood there, two people who had shared a life, now reduced to careful distance. "You didn't have to do this," she said quietly. I met her gaze. "I didn't do this. I responded to what you started." Her lips pressed together. "You're trying to destroy me." I shook my head slowly. "I'm trying to stop being destroyed." She looked away then, as if that answer cost her something. The hearing concluded with the judge requesting even more documentation and setting a date for what he described as a comprehensive review. It was clear now that this case wasn't going to resolve quietly or quickly. Too many claims had been made, too many contradictions exposed. That night I sat alone in my living room, lights low, thinking about how far things had gone. I thought about the man I was before all this, the man who believed love was enough to protect you from betrayal. I wasn't that man anymore, but I wasn't broken either. I was becoming someone steadier, someone who understood that truth, once anchored, could withstand almost anything. As I prepared for the next phase, I knew the courtroom would soon demand more than documents. It would demand testimony, stories told under oath, and I had a feeling that when that moment came, the envelope would no longer be the most dangerous thing in the room. The truth itself would take that place. Testimony changes everything. Documents can be explained away, reframed, buried in language that feels abstract. But when people are asked to speak under oath, to look a judge in the eye and tell a story they've been rehearsing in private, the cracks show. I knew that going into the next hearing, and I could feel the tension tightening as that day approached. Claire was scheduled to testify first. When we arrived at the courthouse that morning, she looked different. Still polished, still composed on the surface, but there was a strain around her eyes that hadn't been there before. She avoided looking at me entirely, focusing instead on her lawyer, who spoke to her in low, urgent tones. I wondered what he was telling her. I wondered if he was warning her, or if he was still trying to salvage the story she'd insisted on telling from the start. The judge reminded her of the seriousness of sworn testimony. His voice was even, almost gentle, but the weight of his words settled heavily in the room. Claire began confidently enough. She spoke about feeling isolated in our marriage, about my long hours, about emotional distance. Listening to her, I felt a familiar ache, not because she was lying about how she felt, but because she was reshaping those feelings into accusations that didn't match reality. Then the questions turned specific: dates, transactions, statements she'd made in filings. Martin didn't interrupt. He waited. He let her talk. When it was time for cross-examination, Martin stood slowly, adjusted his glasses, and asked her to clarify a timeline. She answered quickly, too quickly. He followed up with a document, then another. Each one placed her words beside something tangible: an email, a bank statement, a message thread. The rhythm changed. Claire hesitated, corrected herself, hesitated again. "I may have misspoken," she said at one point, her voice tight. Martin nodded politely. "Of course. Let's try again." The judge leaned forward slightly. I watched his pen pause mid-note more than once. By the time Claire stepped down, the confidence she'd started with was gone. She returned to her seat, pale, whispering urgently to her lawyer. He didn't whisper back. He just stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. I was called next. Walking to the stand felt surreal. I'd imagined this moment so many times, but imagination doesn't capture the way your body reacts, the dryness in your mouth, the way the room seems to narrow. I raised my hand, took the oath, and sat down. Martin guided me gently at first: background, marriage, work. Then the harder questions: how I'd learned about the financial discrepancies, why I hadn't confronted Claire immediately, what my intentions were when I handed over the envelope. "I wanted the truth preserved," I said, my voice steady despite the weight in my chest. I didn't want a story to replace what actually happened. Claire's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively. He tried to paint my preparation as premeditation, my silence as manipulation. He suggested that I'd been planning to ambush Claire all along. I answered calmly, directly, refusing to take the bait. I prepared because I felt something was wrong. I didn't act because I hoped it could be resolved privately. When it couldn't, I relied on facts, not accusations. There was a moment when he asked me if I still loved my wife. The question hung in the air, sharp and personal. I took a breath before answering. I loved the person I thought she was. I don't recognize the person who brought this case." The courtroom was silent for a long beat after that. When I stepped down, my legs felt unsteady, but there was also a strange sense of relief. I'd said what I needed to say. Whatever happened next, my voice was on record. The judge recessed briefly. When he returned, his demeanor had shifted again. More direct, less patient with theatrics. He addressed both lawyers, pointing out inconsistencies, expressing concern about the seriousness of certain claims. He didn't issue a ruling yet, but his message was clear. The court was paying attention. Afterward, in the hallway, Claire's lawyer approached Martin again. This time, he didn't bother lowering his voice much. "We need to talk settlement," he said. Claire overheard him. She spun toward him, eyes flashing. "What are you doing?" she snapped. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and said quietly, "Trying to protect you." She stared at him like he'd betrayed her. That moment stayed with me. It was the first time I saw the power dynamic between them crack. The lawyer who had once been her weapon was now trying to manage the fallout she'd created. Settlement discussions began in earnest. Numbers were floated, terms adjusted. Claire wanted concessions that didn't align with the evidence. Martin pushed back. Slowly, reluctantly, reality edged its way into the conversation. At home, I felt myself changing. The anxiety that once kept me awake at night began to loosen its grip. Not because things were resolved, but because I no longer felt helpless. I was participating in my own defense, not reacting to someone else's story. Friends who had been distant started reaching out again. Some apologized quietly, others asked careful questions. I didn't gloat. I didn't correct every misconception. I let time and truth do their work. The next court date loomed, one that would likely determine the outcome. The judge had made it clear that he expected final arguments and complete transparency. There would be no room left for half-truths. The night before, I sat alone and thought about the envelope again, about how small it seemed for something that had carried so much weight. It wasn't magic, it wasn't revenge, it was simply the result of paying attention when it mattered most. I didn't know yet how the judge would rule. I didn't know what Claire would do when faced with the full consequences of her choices. But I did know one thing with certainty. Whatever happened next, it would be grounded in reality, not a carefully curated lie. And for the first time since the day those papers were served at my desk, that felt like enough. The closer we got to the final hearing, the quieter everything became. It was the kind of quiet that doesn't bring peace, only tension. No more dramatic filings, no sharp emails, no public posturing, just preparation. Careful, deliberate, unavoidable preparation. I could feel it in my chest every morning when I woke up, that steady pressure reminding me that the end of something enormous was approaching. Claire had stopped reaching out to friends altogether. The few people we still had in common told me she'd withdrawn, that she barely left her apartment except for meetings with her lawyer. I didn't take any satisfaction in that. If anything, it made me sad. This was never what I wanted for either of us. But wanting and reality had parted ways a long time ago. Martin and I met one last time before the hearing. He was methodical as always, but there was a firmness in his voice that hadn't been there before. "The judge has seen enough," he said, tapping the folder in front of him. "This is no longer about persuasion, it's about confirmation." He walked me through the final strategy. No surprises, no theatrics, just clarity. The envelope's contents had already done most of the work. Now the court needed to formally acknowledge what had been revealed. The morning of the hearing, I arrived early and sat alone on a wooden bench outside the courtroom. I watched other people come and go, some whispering urgently, others staring at the floor. It struck me how many lives pass through that hallway every day, each one carrying its own version of heartbreak. Mine just happened to involve a woman I once trusted with everything. When Claire arrived, she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but emotionally. The confidence she once wore like armor was gone. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away, her shoulders tense. Her lawyer spoke to her quietly, his tone controlled, professional, almost resigned. Inside the courtroom, the air felt heavier than before. The judge entered, reviewed his notes, and began without delay. Final arguments. Martin spoke first. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't appeal to emotion. He walked the judge through the facts one last time, connecting the dots with calm precision. Timelines, financial records, contradictions under oath. He emphasized intent not as an accusation, but as an unavoidable conclusion. When Claire's lawyer stood, there was a noticeable shift. His argument was shorter, more cautious. He focused on emotional context, on stress, on misunderstandings. He avoided repeating the claims that had already been weakened. It felt less like a defense and more like damage control. The judge listened, impassive. When both sides finished, he leaned back slightly and folded his hands. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear my own heartbeat. He began by summarizing the case, not dramatically, not cruelly, just plainly. He acknowledged the emotional complexity of marriage and divorce, then pivoted to the legal responsibilities that came with sworn statements and financial disclosures. His words were measured, but each sentence carried weight. He addressed Claire directly at one point, reminding her of the seriousness of misrepresentation and the consequences of providing inaccurate information to the court. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't scold. That made it worse. Authority doesn't need volume. When he finally announced his decision, it felt almost anticlimactic. The ruling favored me on every major point. Claims against me were dismissed. Financial responsibility was reassigned based on verified records. The judge ordered corrections to the record, making it clear that the narrative presented by Claire could not stand. Claire's shoulders slumped as the words settled in. Her lawyer closed his folder slowly, like someone accepting the end of a long, losing argument. I didn't feel triumph. What I felt was release, a loosening in my chest I hadn't realized was possible. Months of tension drained away in that quiet courtroom, replaced with something gentler. Validation, yes, but also closure. Afterwards, outside the courthouse, Claire stood a few feet from me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she spoke, her voice low, stripped of its usual sharpness. "I didn't think you'd fight like this," she said. I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt a strange mix of compassion and distance. "I didn't think I'd have to," I replied. She nodded once as if that answer settled something, then turned and walked away without another word. Martin shook my hand. "You handled this exactly right. You stayed steady." As I walked to my car, the city looked the same as it always had, but I didn't. The weight I'd been carrying since that day at work was finally gone. The envelope had done its job, but more importantly, I had learned something about myself. Silence isn't weakness, preparation isn't cruelty, and truth, when protected, has a way of standing up for itself. I drove home knowing that while the legal battle was over, the emotional aftermath still needed to be faced. Healing doesn't happen in a courtroom. It happens in the quiet days that follow, when you learn how to live again without the person you once built your world around. And that was the next chapter waiting for me. The days after the ruling felt strangely hollow. I'd expected relief to arrive like a wave, something overwhelming and immediate. Instead, it came quietly, in small moments I barely noticed at first. Sleeping through the night, drinking my coffee without that constant knot in my stomach, walking into my office without feeling like I was carrying a secret everyone could see. At work, things shifted back to normal faster than I expected. People stopped looking at me with that careful sympathy, the kind that never quite knows where to land. My supervisor called me into his office one afternoon, closed the door, and simply said, "I'm glad that's behind you." No prying, no judgment, just acknowledgement. It meant more than he probably realized. At home, though, the silence was louder. The house no longer felt tense, but it felt unfinished, like a place that had been paused mid-story. I began making small changes, rearranging furniture, clearing out the guest room Claire had claimed as her office. Each decision felt symbolic, even if it didn't need to be. I was reclaiming space, physically and emotionally. Claire didn't contact me again after the hearing. Through the grapevine, I heard she changed lawyers shortly afterward. I also heard she was angry, telling people the system had failed her, that technicalities had overshadowed her pain. I didn't correct those stories. I didn't need to anymore. The court record spoke for itself. One evening, a few weeks later, I received an email from her. It was brief, almost clinical. She acknowledged the ruling, agreed to the remaining logistical steps, and asked that future communication go through email only. There was no apology, no explanation, just finality. I read it twice, then replied just as simply. It felt like closing a door without slamming it. What surprised me most was the emotional aftershock. Once the fight was over, all the feelings I'd pushed aside came rushing back. Grief, disappointment, a deep, aching sadness for the life I thought I was building. I let myself feel it this time. I took long walks. I sat with memories instead of running from them. Healing, I learned, isn't about erasing the past. It's about making room for it without letting it consume you. I started seeing a therapist at Martin's suggestion. At first, I wasn't sure what to say. I'd spent so long being composed, measured, prepared. Letting go of that armor felt risky. But gradually, I began to talk about trust, about how quietly it can break, about how betrayal doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it slips in while you're busy believing in someone. One session, the therapist asked me why I thought the public service at work had hurt so much. I hadn't considered that question deeply before. After a moment, I realized it wasn't just the embarrassment, it was the intention. Claire hadn't just wanted to leave, she'd wanted to define me on her way out. That realization changed something in me. It helped me understand why I needed the truth documented, preserved, undeniable. Weeks turned into months. The legal paperwork wrapped up. Accounts were closed, transferred, finalized. Each signature felt like another thread cut cleanly. I began to notice the sense of lightness creeping into my days. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The quiet kind that doesn't demand anything from you. One afternoon, I ran into an old friend I hadn't seen since before the divorce. We sat for coffee, catching up cautiously at first, then more easily. At one point, he said, "You seem steadier." I laughed softly. "I feel like I finally know where I stand," I said, and I meant it. I thought often about the envelope, about how such a small object had carried so much weight. It wasn't just evidence, it was a line I'd drawn for myself, a moment where I decided that I wouldn't let someone else tell my story unchallenged. That decision, more than the ruling itself, felt like the true turning point. Late one night, unable to sleep, I pulled out the last box of items I hadn't sorted through yet. At the bottom was our wedding album. I hesitated, then opened it. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel regret. I felt acceptance. We were real once. That mattered. It just wasn't the end of the story. As I closed the album, I realized something else, too. I wasn't afraid of being quiet anymore. Silence had carried me through the worst of it. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of restraint, of observation, of patience. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, I'd learned the power of waiting. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of direction I hadn't felt in years. Not a plan exactly, just a willingness to see what came next without bracing for impact. The chapter with Claire was closed, but the lessons it left behind were still unfolding. And as I stood there, coffee warming my hands, sunlight creeping through the window, I understood that while the courtroom gave me justice, life was about to offer me something else entirely, a chance to begin again, this time with my eyes open. Life didn't suddenly become bright or effortless after everything ended. What it became was honest. That honesty showed up in small, unremarkable ways at first. I noticed how I no longer flinched when my phone buzzed, how mail no longer triggered a tightness in my chest, how the sound of my own footsteps in the house felt grounding instead of lonely. These weren't victories anyone else could see, but they mattered more than the court ruling ever could. I began reconnecting with parts of myself I had neglected for years. Simple things, cooking real meals instead of reheating whatever was fastest, running again in the early mornings, letting the rhythm of my breath remind me that my body was still capable, still mine. On those runs, I often replayed the past, not to punish myself, but to understand it. I could see now how often I had chosen peace over clarity, how I'd mistaken patience for endurance. There's a difference, I learned. One preserves you, the other slowly erases you. A few months after the divorce was finalized, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. It was Claire's sister. We'd always been cordial, not close, but her words were careful and sincere. She thanked me for not dragging the family through public chaos, for keeping things contained even when I had every reason not to. She didn't defend Claire, but she didn't condemn her either. She just acknowledged the cost of everything that had happened. That message stayed with me. It reminded me that even when people fail each other, restraint still has ripple effects. You never really know who's watching how you carry yourself when things fall apart. I also learned that reputations have a strange way of healing when you don't chase them. At work, a new project came my way, one that required a high level of trust and discretion. My manager didn't make a speech about it, he just assigned it to me, like it was obvious. That quiet vote of confidence meant more to me than any public vindication. Every so often, I'd hear updates about Claire. She was starting over, telling people she'd been misunderstood, that the divorce had been messy and unfair. I didn't correct those stories. I didn't need to. I had learned that peace isn't found in winning every narrative. It's found in choosing which ones no longer deserve your energy. One evening, while cleaning out old digital files, I came across drafts of emails I'd never sent to her. Messages written late at night during the worst months, full of questions, confusion, and restrained hurt. I read them slowly, then deleted them all. Not out of bitterness, but because they belonged to a version of me that no longer existed. Closure doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from releasing the need to ask. The memory of that day at work, the lawyer, the folder, the stares, still surfaced from time to time, but it no longer carried shame. It had transformed into something else entirely. A reminder of composure under pressure, of the moment I chose not to react, but to respond. That distinction had reshaped everything that followed. I began to understand the deeper lesson beneath it all. Truth doesn't need a spotlight to survive. It needs patience, protection, and the courage to let it stand on its own when the moment arrives. The envelope wasn't powerful because it was dramatic. It was powerful because it was prepared. As the year turned, I found myself looking forward instead of back, not with grand expectations, but with a quiet readiness. I didn't know who I'd become next or what shape my life would take, but I trusted myself in a way I hadn't before. I trusted my instincts. I trusted my restraint. I trusted my ability to endure without disappearing. One night, sitting alone with a glass of water and the windows open, I realized something that stopped me cold. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Claire, not at myself. The anger had done its job. It had protected me long enough for clarity to arrive. Now it could rest. What remained was wisdom earned the hard way. The understanding that when someone tries to break you publicly, the strongest response isn't spectacle, it's steadiness. It's letting the truth walk into the room on its own terms, knowing it doesn't need to shout to be heard. And with that understanding came a final sense of calm, the kind that tells you a chapter is truly finished, not because the pain is gone, but because it no longer controls the story. The morning I realized the story was truly over didn't arrive with ceremony, no milestone date circled on the calendar, no dramatic realization. It came quietly, the way most real endings do. I was standing in line at a grocery store, watching the cashier joke with the customer ahead of me, when it struck me that I hadn't thought about the divorce once that day. Not with bitterness, not with vigilance, not even with reflection. It simply hadn't been there. And that absence told me more than any courtroom ruling ever could. For a long time, my life had been organized around defense, defending my character, defending my silence, defending the version of myself that existed before someone else tried to redefine it. I hadn't noticed how exhausting that was until I no longer needed to do it. Without that weight, ordinary moments felt lighter, conversations felt unguarded. Even solitude felt like a choice instead of a consequence. I began saying yes to things again, not out of obligation, but curiosity. Dinner invitations, weekend trips, conversations that didn't revolve around explaining myself. I met people who knew nothing about my past, and I let them. There was freedom in that anonymity, in being received without a preface. One evening, while attending a small gathering hosted by a colleague, someone asked me a simple question. What changed you the most in the last year? It wasn't asked with drama, just genuine interest. I thought about it for a moment before answering. I learned that preparation is a form of self-respect, I said. They nodded, not fully understanding, and that was fine. Some truths are earned privately. Later that night, driving home, I reflected on how close I'd come to handling everything differently. I could have argued publicly. I could have fired back with accusations of my own. I could have let anger dictate my every move. Plenty of people would have applauded that. But applause fades quickly. Consequences don't. What saved me wasn't cleverness or cruelty. It was restraint. The decision to stay quiet long enough to see clearly. The decision to gather truth instead of noise. That choice didn't just protect me in court, it preserved who I was when everything else was being challenged. I thought again about Claire, not with resentment, but with a distant compassion. I finally understood that she hadn't just been trying to leave the marriage, she had been trying to escape accountability. And when escape failed, she tried to rewrite reality. That didn't make her a monster, it made her human in a flawed, fearful way. But understanding that didn't mean excusing it. Boundaries can coexist with empathy. Months later, I received one final communication from her. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't emotional. It was an acknowledgement that certain legal corrections had been finalized. At the bottom of the message, after the formalities, there was a single sentence that surprised me. It didn't occur to me how prepared you would be. I stared at that line for a long time before closing the email. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Preparation had already spoken for me. That night, I took the envelope, the original one, now empty, and placed it in the shredder. Watching it disappear felt symbolic, like releasing an artifact from a battle I no longer needed to remember in detail. The lesson remained, the evidence didn't. What stayed with me instead was clarity about relationships, about power, about how easily silence is mistaken for weakness by people who rely on volume to survive. I learned that the loudest person in the room often isn't the strongest. The strongest is the one who knows when to speak and when not to. I started mentoring a younger colleague at work not long after. He reminded me of myself years ago, hardworking, dependable, quietly overlooked. One afternoon, after a difficult meeting, he asked me how I stayed so calm when things got tense. I smiled and told him the truth. I listen first, I prepare second, and I never confuse urgency with importance. He laughed, not sure if I was serious. I was. As time passed, the story that once defined me became something I carried lightly, not hidden, but no longer heavy. When people asked about my divorce, I told them it was difficult and that I learned a lot. I didn't give details. I didn't need to. My peace didn't require their understanding. Looking back now, I see that the day I was served papers at work wasn't the worst day of my life. It just felt like it at the time. In reality, it was the moment I stopped being passive in my own story. Not aggressive, not vindictive, just present. The envelope didn't destroy my wife's case because it was clever or shocking. It destroyed it because it was honest, because it couldn't be argued with or reinterpreted, because truth, when preserved carefully, eventually demands to be acknowledged. If there's one thing I hope anyone listening to this takes away, it's this. You don't have to shout to be heard. You don't have to rush to be right. And you don't have to destroy someone else to protect yourself. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay steady while the truth catches up. I lost a marriage. I lost a future I thought I understood. But I gained something more valuable than either of them: self-trust. And once you have that, no courtroom, no accusation, no public humiliation can take it away from you. The story ends not with revenge, but with release. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like more than enough.